Zara Williams adjusted her backpack straps as she stood before the imposing brick facade of Millfield High School. The September morning air carried the scent of changing leaves, but all she could feel was the familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach that came with being the new kid. Again. At 15, she'd attended 7 different schools thanks to her father's military assignments. Each move meant starting over, making new friends, and proving herself all over again. But this time felt different. This time, her father had promised they'd stay put for at least 2 years. Colonel Marcus Williams, her father, had recently been reassigned to a classified position at a nearby military installation. What the neighbors didn't know was that Marcus was one of the Army's elite Delta Force commanders, a man whose very existence was kept secret from most of the world. "You've got this, baby girl," she whispered to herself, repeating the words her father always said before difficult missions. Taking a deep breath, she pushed through the front doors. The hallways buzzed with the typical chaos of a Monday morning. Students clustered around lockers, comparing weekend stories and complaining about upcoming tests. Zara made her way to the main office, her military-issued boots clicking against the polished floor. "You must be Zara Williams," said Mrs. Henderson, the guidance counselor, with a warm smile. "Welcome to Millfield High. I have your schedule right here." As Mrs. Henderson handed over her class schedule, Zara noticed a group of students staring at her through the office window. She caught the eye of a tall, blonde girl who quickly looked away, whispering something to her friends that made them all laugh. "Don't mind them," Mrs. Henderson said softly. "Some of our students take time to warm up to new faces. You'll find your crowd." By lunchtime, Zara had managed to navigate her morning classes without incident. She was intelligent, articulate, and confident, traits that came from growing up in a military household where excellence was expected, not optional. She sat alone in the cafeteria, reading a book on military strategy, a habit that earned her strange looks, when the blonde girl from the office window approached with 3 friends. Well, the girl said, sliding into the seat across from Zara without invitation. "I'm Madison Pierce. My dad owns half this town, including the bank that probably holds your family's mortgage." Zara looked up calmly. "Nice to meet you, Madison. That's an interesting accent you've got there. Where are you from exactly?" Madison's tone was sweet, but her eyes were cold. "Everywhere," Zara replied simply. "Military family." "How exotic," Madison said, the word dripping with disdain. "I suppose we should make you feel welcome. After all, we wouldn't want you to feel out of place." The other girls giggled, and Zara recognized the dynamic immediately. She'd seen it at other schools, the queen bee and her followers, looking for someone to target. Usually, she could navigate these situations diplomatically. But something in Madison's tone set her on edge. Over the next few weeks, the harassment began subtly. Zara's locker was vandalized with crude drawings and slurs. Her textbooks mysteriously disappeared. Whispers followed her through the hallways, and she found herself increasingly isolated. At home, she said nothing to her father. Marcus had enough on his plate with his new assignment, and Zara had always prided herself on handling her own battles. Besides, she dealt with bullies before. This would pass, but Madison Pierce wasn't like other bullies. She was smart, calculating, and had resources. Her father's position in the town gave her a sense of untouchability, and she used it ruthlessly. "You know what I heard?" Madison said loudly in the hallway one day, making sure everyone could hear. "I heard that military brats like her move around so much because their parents can't hold down real jobs. Probably living off welfare." Zara's jaw tightened, but she kept walking. Her father had taught her that sometimes the best response was no response at all. 3 weeks into October, things came to a head. Zara was walking home through the wooded path that served as a shortcut to her neighborhood when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see Madison and 4 other students, including 2 boys she recognized as star athletes. "Going somewhere, Army brat?" Madison called out. Zara kept walking, her senses on high alert. Her father had trained her in basic self-defense, and she could feel the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with potential danger. "We're talking to you," one of the boys, Jake Morrison, said as they caught up to her. "I heard you," Zara replied evenly. "I just don't have anything to say to you." "That's rude," Madison said. "We just want to have a little chat. About your place in this town." Before Zara could react, Jake grabbed her backpack and yanked it off her shoulders. The contents spilled across the forest floor, textbooks, pens, and a small framed photo of her and her father in his dress uniform. Madison picked up the photo, examining it with mock interest. "Ah, how sweet. Daddy's little soldier girl." She held it up for the others to see. "Look at all those ribbons. I bet he got them for participation trophies." "Give it back," Zara said, her voice low and dangerous. "Or what?" Madison laughed. "You'll call your daddy?" Oh wait, I forgot, military brats don't have real families. Just drill sergeants pretending to be parents. That crossed the line. Zara lunged for the photo, but the two boys grabbed her arms, holding her back. Now that's not very ladylike, Madison sked. I think you need to learn some manners. Some respect for your betters. They dragged her to a large oak tree, and before Zara fully understood what was happening, they had rope they'd apparently brought with them, meaning this was premeditated. What are you doing? Zara demanded, struggling against their grip. Teaching you a lesson, Madison replied coldly. About knowing your place. They tied her to the tree with practiced efficiency, binding her arms behind her back and around the trunk. The rope was tight enough to restrict her movement but not tight enough to cut off circulation. They'd done this before, Zara realized with horror. This is assault, Zara said, forcing her voice to remain steady. You'll be arrested. Madison laughed. By who? The sheriff? He's my godfather. The principal? He's up for re-election to the school board, and my father controls the biggest voting bloc in town. She leaned in close. Nobody's going to help you, army brat. This is our town, and you're nothing. They left her there as the sun began to set, taking her backpack and scattering her belongings through the woods. Madison kept the photo of her father. We'll be back tomorrow to see if you've learned your lesson, Madison called over her shoulder. Maybe if you apologize nicely and promise to transfer schools, we'll consider letting you go. As their footsteps faded, Zara forced herself to remain calm. Panic would only make things worse. Her father had taught her that survival started with clear thinking, and right now, she needed to think. The rope was thick but not expertly tied. Whoever had done this had watched too many movies and not enough actual training. She began working her wrists in small circles, feeling for weak points in the binding. 20 minutes later, she had loosened the rope enough to slip one hand free. Another 10 minutes, and she was completely untied. She gathered what belongings she could find in the growing darkness and made her way home. Marcus Williams was in his study when she walked through the front door. He looked up from his files and immediately noticed her disheveled appearance, the rope burns on her wrists, and the dirt on her clothes. What happened? His voice was calm, but Zara could see the dangerous glint in his eyes, the same look she'd seen in old photos of him in combat zones. For the first time since starting at Millfield High, Zara told her father everything. Marcus Williams listened without interruption as his daughter recounted the weeks of harassment culminating in the afternoon's assault. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, processing the information with the tactical mind that had made him one of the military's most effective special operations commanders. Show me your wrists, he said quietly. Zara rolled up her sleeves, revealing the red marks where the rope had chafed her skin. Marcus examined the injuries with the clinical eye of someone who'd seen worse, but Zara could feel the barely controlled fury radiating from him. When he spoke, his voice was deadly calm. This stops tomorrow. Dad, I can handle. No. He looked at her with the kind of authority that had commanded respect in the world's most dangerous places. This crossed a line. They assaulted my daughter and committed a felony. This is no longer about school bullying. He walked to his desk and pulled out his phone. I'm going to make some calls. In the meantime, you're not going to school tomorrow. I can't hide from them forever. Marcus smiled, not a pleasant expression. You're not hiding. You're letting me handle this the proper way. Trust me, Zara. I've been dealing with bullies a lot longer than you have. Just different kinds of bullies. That night, Marcus Williams did what he did best. He gathered intelligence. By morning, he knew more about Madison Pierce and her family than they probably knew about themselves. Madison's father, Robert Pierce, was indeed a wealthy businessman who owned several local enterprises, including the bank. But Marcus also discovered that Pierce had been under investigation by the IRS for tax evasion, had several outstanding lawsuits from former employees alleging workplace discrimination, and had defaulted on 3 separate business loans in the past 5 years. Jake Morrison's father was the high school football coach and had been covering up his son's failing grades to keep him eligible for sports. The sheriff that Madison claimed as her godfather had been falsifying overtime reports and was vulnerable to audit. By 6 a.m., Marcus had compiled dossiers on every person involved in his daughter's assault, as well as their parents and key supporters. Knowledge was power, and he intended to use it strategically. Marcus Williams arrived at Millfield High School at 7:30 a.m., 30 minutes before classes began. He wore his dress uniform, not because he had to, but because he wanted everyone to know exactly who they were dealing with. The uniform told a story that most civilians couldn't fully read, but the basics were clear enough: multiple deployment ribbons, a bronze star, a purple heart, and several commendations that indicated this was not a man to be taken lightly. Walked directly to the principal's office, where Principal Johnson was just arriving with his morning coffee. Mr. Johnson, Marcus said with military courtesy, I'm Colonel Marcus Williams, Zara Williams' father. I believe we need to have a conversation about what happened to my daughter yesterday. Principal Johnson, a soft man in his 50s who'd never served in the military, was immediately intimidated by Marcus's presence. The uniform, the bearing, the controlled intensity, it all screamed danger. Of course, Colonel Williams. Please, come in. Marcus entered the office and closed the door behind him. He remained standing, a subtle power play that put him at a physical advantage over the seated principal. Yesterday, 5 students from your school assaulted my daughter. They tied her to a tree in the woods and left her there. This constitutes kidnapping, false imprisonment, and assault, all felonies under state law. Principal Johnson's face went white. I had no idea. Zara didn't report. My daughter shouldn't have to report a felony assault to the school administration, Marcus interrupted. Your job is to provide a safe learning environment. You have failed spectacularly. He placed a folder on the principal's desk. Inside, you'll find photos of my daughter's injuries, a detailed timeline of the harassment she's endured, and witness statements from several students who were too afraid to speak up before. Principal Johnson opened the folder with shaking hands. Marcus had been thorough, the evidence was overwhelming and professionally compiled. What do you want me to do? Johnson asked. You're going to suspend all 5 students involved, pending a full investigation. You're going to implement new anti-bullying policies with actual enforcement mechanisms. And you're going to ensure that my daughter receives a formal apology from each perpetrator. But Madison Pierce, her father, is very influential in this community. He's a major donor to the school. Marcus leaned forward, placing his hands on the desk. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. Mr. Johnson, let me be very clear. I have spent the last 15 years of my life hunting down people who thought they were untouchable. I have eliminated threats to national security in places you couldn't pronounce. One small-town businessman and his spoiled daughter do not concern me. He straightened up. You have until noon to suspend those students. After that, I involve the police, the district attorney, and the state education department. Are we clear? Principal Johnson nodded rapidly. Yes, sir. Crystal clear. By 10 a.m., Madison Pierce and her 4 accomplices were sitting in the principal's office, suspended indefinitely pending investigation. The news spread through the school like wildfire. At 11 a.m., Robert Pierce stormed into the school, demanding to see Principal Johnson. He found Marcus Williams waiting for him instead. You must be Pierce, Marcus said, not offering to shake hands. I'm Colonel Williams. Pierce was a large man, used to intimidating others through size and wealth. But standing across from Marcus Williams, he felt distinctly outmatched. What is this nonsense about my daughter? Pierce blustered. Madison would never. Your daughter and 4 other students committed multiple felonies against my child, Marcus interrupted. I have evidence, witnesses, and documentation. The question now is whether we handle this through the school system or through the courts. Pierce's face reddened. You can't threaten me. Do you know who I am in this town? Marcus smiled coldly. Do you know who I am, period? He pulled out his phone and showed Pierce a photograph, satellite imagery of Pierce's downtown office building. This was taken 3 days ago by military surveillance satellites. I can have real-time intelligence on any location within a 6-hour window. He put the phone away. Your influence extends to the city limits of Millfield. Mine extends somewhat further. The color drained from Pierce's face as the implications sank in. Now, Marcus continued, here's what's going to happen. Your daughter is going to write a formal apology to my daughter. She's going to serve her suspension without complaint. And you're going to ensure she understands that any further harassment will result in criminal charges. And if I refuse? Marcus's expression didn't change. Then I make some phone calls. The IRS receives some interesting information about your tax filings. The State Banking Commission learns about your loan defaults. The local newspaper gets copies of the discrimination lawsuits your former employees filed. Pierce stared at him in shock. You investigated me? Mr. Pierce, investigating people is what I do for a living. And I'm very good at my job. Word of the confrontation spread quickly through Millfield's small community. By the end of the week, everyone knew that the new girl's father was not someone to cross. Madison Pierce and her friends returned to school after a week's suspension, subdued and avoiding Zara entirely. The formal apologies were delivered in writing, as requested, and the harassment stopped completely, but Marcus Williams wasn't finished. He arranged to speak to the entire student body during an assembly, ostensibly about military careers and service opportunities. What he actually delivered was a masterclass in leadership, respect, and consequences. I've spent my career working with people from every background imaginable, he told the assembled students. Rich, poor, black, white, American, foreign, none of that matters when you're facing a real challenge. What matters is character. What matters is how you treat people who can't fight back. He paused, his eyes scanning the audience and lingering briefly on Madison Pierce. Bullies exist everywhere, in schools, in workplaces, in governments. They prey on people they perceive as different or vulnerable. But here's what bullies never understand: they're always cowards. Because real strength doesn't come from hurting others. Real strength comes from protecting others. The assembly was completely silent. Even the teachers were hanging on every word. My daughter has moved 7 times in her 15 years. She's had to start over again and again, make new friends, adapt to new places. That hasn't made her weak, it's made her incredibly strong. Stronger than people who've never faced real challenges. He looked directly at Madison now. And anyone who mistakes kindness for weakness, or mistakes being new for being vulnerable, is going to learn a very hard lesson about what real strength looks like. In the weeks that followed, Zara found herself in an unexpectedly different position at school. Students who had previously ignored her began approaching with cautious respect. Teachers who had written her off as just another military brat began recognizing her intelligence and discipline. More importantly, she began connecting with other students who had been on the periphery, the quiet ones, the different ones, the ones who had also been targets of Madison Pierce's circle. There was David Chin, a brilliant sophomore who'd been bullied for his academic achievements. Maria Santos, who'd been mocked for her family's economic situation. Alex Thompson, who'd been harassed for being openly gay. Together, they formed an unlikely but strong alliance. Zara's experience and her father's lessons in leadership helped her organize them into a force for positive change at the school. They started a peer counseling group for students dealing with bullying. They lobbied for better enforcement of anti-harassment policies. They created a support network that ensured no student had to face their problems alone. Madison Pierce and her former followers found themselves increasingly isolated as their previous victims gained confidence and support. 6 months later, Millfield High School had transformed. The toxic culture that had allowed systematic bullying was replaced by a community where differences were celebrated rather than attacked. Zara had not only found her place but had helped create a place where others could belong as well. Principal Johnson, initially resistant to change, had become one of their strongest advocates. The new anti-bullying policies were being studied by other schools in the district as a model program. Even Robert Pierce had come around, quietly donating money to fund the peer counseling program, perhaps motivated by genuine remorse, or perhaps by the knowledge that Marcus Williams was still watching. Madison Pierce herself remained largely silent and withdrawn. Some said she was planning to transfer to a private school. Others claimed she was seeing a therapist to deal with her own issues. Zara chose not to speculate. She'd learned from her father that sometimes the greatest victory was simply making the problem go away. One evening in spring, as Zara sat in her father's study working on homework, she asked him a question that had been bothering her. "Dad, did you really have satellite surveillance on Mr. Pierce's building?" Marcus looked up from his own paperwork and smiled. "What do you think?" "I think you probably did. But I also think it didn't matter whether you did or not. He believed you could, and that was enough." "That's a very astute observation. What else did you learn from this situation?" Zara considered the question carefully. "I learned that bullies usually become bullies because they feel powerless about something in their own lives. Madison's father puts a lot of pressure on her to be perfect, to maintain the family reputation. She was taking out her frustrations on people she saw as safe targets. And I learned that sometimes the best way to stop a bully isn't to become a bigger bully. It's to change the entire dynamic so that bullying doesn't work anymore." Marcus nodded approvingly. "That's the difference between tactics and strategy. Tactics win individual battles. Strategy wins the war." He closed his file and gave her his full attention. "But the most important lesson is this: you didn't need me to rescue you. You needed me to level the playing field so you could fight your own battles. There's a difference." "What do you mean?" "You handled Madison Pierce and her friends every day for weeks. You kept your dignity, you didn't escalate the situation, and you gathered intelligence about your opponents. When they finally crossed the line into criminal behavior, you still handled it correctly. You came to the appropriate authority figure and reported a crime." He stood up and walked over to her chair. "I just made sure that the authority figures in question understood the seriousness of the situation and were motivated to do their jobs properly. The rest, the way you've built alliances, created positive change, and turned a toxic environment into a supportive community, that's all you." Zara Williams graduated from Millfield High School as valedictorian, 2 years later. Her graduation speech focused on the power of communities to protect their most vulnerable members. She went on to attend West Point, following in her father's footsteps but forging her own path. The leadership skills she developed at Millfield served her well in military training. and she excelled in courses on conflict resolution and community building. Madison Pierce did transfer to a private school her senior year, but not before seeking out Zara to deliver a personal apology, one that seemed genuine rather than forced. She went on to study social work in college, perhaps having learned something about the damage that unchecked privilege could cause. Principal Johnson implemented the Millfield Model Anti-Bullying Program throughout the district and was eventually promoted to Superintendent. David, Maria, Alex, and the others who had been part of Zara's alliance remained lifelong friends, each carrying forward the lessons about standing up for others and creating inclusive communities. And Marcus Williams continued his classified work, secure in the knowledge that he'd raised a daughter who understood the difference between strength and force, between leadership and domination, and between winning battles and building lasting peace. The tree where Zara had been tied up was eventually cut down to make room for a new community center, a place where young people could gather safely, learn from each other, and find support when they needed it. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't the ones that make headlines. Sometimes they're the quiet transformations that happen one person, one community, one choice at a time, and sometimes it takes someone with the training to handle the world's most dangerous threats to teach a small town that the real enemy isn't the person who's different, it's the fear and ignorance that makes us want to hurt what we don't understand. The story of Zara Williams and Millfield High School became a case study in how communities can change, how young people can lead that change, and how sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is simply refusing to accept it as normal. But perhaps most importantly, it was a story about a father and daughter who understood that real strength comes not from the ability to destroy your enemies, but from the wisdom to transform them into something better.